Welcome. We're going to get started in just a few seconds. We're waiting for everyone to join. We have 2,800 people registered for this LinkedIn Live event. So we'll get started in a few seconds and we'll get going. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kristin Zecca. I am a director in executive education at MIT Sloan, a lecturer and executive coach. And we are thrilled to be here today to have a conversation with Kate Isaacs and Kara Penn about how to have difficult conversations and the listening challenge. We know in our work, in our lives, we all have conversations and topics that are harder to bring up. So what are some tools for navigating that? That's what we're going to talk about today, and that's why we're here. So I'd like to start with introducing our presenters today. Kate Isaacs is a senior lecturer at MIT Sloan. She teaches and advises leaders on nimble and distributed leadership. So distributed leadership is moving away from command and to control, traditional leadership model, to power over leadership. And a power over to power with. This relies on persuasion, inspiration, non-bureaucratic ways of aligning people around a mission, vision, and values. So Kate also teaches courses on inclusive innovation. How do you use business power in communities to drive place-based prosperity by shifting from charity to solidarity for diverse talent development and inclusive economic growth? Kate also facilitates complex stakeholder engagements. For example, like work with an engagement between a power company and environmental stakeholders. She also studies how dialogue's used to find common ground, most recently on the abortion issue. So Kate has a lot of experience having conversations and dialogues across a variety of realms. We're also joined today by Kara Penn, who's a MIT Sloan alum as well. And she's the co-author of Fail Better, Design Smart Mistakes to Succeed Sooner. And she's the principal owner of Mission Spark, a strategy consultancy that focuses on achieving systems level change through inclusive processes. Kara has also facilitated multi-stakeholder collaboratives to achieve shared visions for more than 20 years. Kara promotes empathy and understanding, aligns incentives to achieve collective results, and brings iterative experimentation to complex issues where no easy solutions exist. So we have two people here today who have a lot of experience with difficult conversations, and I'm going to hand it over to Kate and Kara to introduce the topic and talk more about what we're going to discuss today.
Thanks, Kristin. Appreciate that. So we're thrilled to be here and with all of you in this LinkedIn Live. I hope we have the opportunity to answer your questions. We assume that you're coming here today in part because you're in a place where you're having difficult conversations and, you know, feeling the challenge of that. And that might be across the dinner table, and it might be within the office or in collaborative work that you're doing. And so I really hope that we can bring our experience and expertise to support you in a meaningful way. I'm going to kick this off a little bit by having Kate share a little bit about her story and journey to this work, and then I'll share a little bit for me, and we'll get started with introducing the tool that we created together. And we think this first part will just be about 10 to 12 minutes of setting a framework, and then most of this is going to be interactive and answering the questions that you all have and engaging with you. So really happy to be here. So Kate?
Great. Well, welcome everyone. I see we have a wide-ranging crowd from around the world, from the Boston area where I'm sitting right now to Brazil. Hello, Brazil and Thailand and Pakistan and Argentina. It's great to have just a couple of mentions and shout outs to all of you folks joining us from around the world. So I can see that having difficult conversations is a global issue that we're all wondering about. And I just want to share personally, part of what we want to talk about today is how part of having difficult conversations is sharing things about yourself. In fact, that's where you start. So I want to share with you just a bit about myself and where I started with this, which was back in the early days of the pandemic. We have a very polarized situation in the United States. We are fighting about whether we should have masks, whether we should have vaccines. We're fighting about politics. And I was very bothered by the fact that I couldn't even have a conversation in my own family about some of our political situation, and I couldn't even share how I was voting, and my family members couldn't seem to share how they were voting, because there is such an emotionally charged environment here in the United States, as well as I know that's the situation in many parts of the world. So Kara and I got together and started to think, well, what can we do about this? And how can we bring what we know about both social science research and negotiation about what helps to have these difficult conversations and have a victory out of those, and put it in a simple format that could be helpful not only in our country, but at the dinner table with my own dad, for instance. And I'll tell a story about that when we get into this, to have a better conversation about some of the issues in the country. So that's what brought me into this. And Kara, why don't you say a few words too about your own connection to this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, when I was about 15 years old, I really became interested in kind of the systems level changes and needs that were out there, big global issues that were facing us. A lot of that had to do with climate and environmental issues, but other, challenging concerns. And I think I've come at this from a place of empathy and a place from, how do we work together and collaborate? So for the past 25 years or so, my own journey has been one of collaborative leadership and collaborative problem solving. And one of the things that I've noticed on this journey is that in recent years, as things have become maybe more polarized, as we do more online and virtually, as we engage in social media, that there's been a really pronounced othering of people. So we're kind of dehumanizing each other to make our points. And the more we make our points, the more intractable we get in changing our viewpoints. And so as someone who's done this type of collaborative work for a really long time, it's been amazing to me to see the spillover of that polarization show up in, physical collaborative spaces or virtual collaborative spaces. And so I think that was very motivating for me. And then like Kate, our own personal stories of family members who have very different perspectives as we went through election cycles, and we're struggling to just have conversations about that and to engage. And so personally coming from a long history, a long passion for this work, and then seeing the change over time. And as Kate was mentioning, this really led us to that level of polarization, of which almost 90% of Americans feel like polarization is threatening our way of life, really led us to the creation of a tool, something that we call the Listening Challenge. We partnered, with Benjamin Swift, a colleague of ours, and we created a tool that we'll put into the chat so that everybody can see that. And I know we'll also put it across the banner, that essentially creates a container, an opportunity to engage with somebody who has a different viewpoint than you do, and a polarized viewpoint, to create a safe space for that conversation, to have some guiding questions, and a little bit of scripting that can help support a process together, and to be able to engage and just really listen, to understand and to create a human connection with somebody else without necessarily having to be right. And so that's been our journey in creating the Listening Challenge. But we know that beyond kind of the personal framing that we work within, so many of these issues come up in our business environments as well. And so today is really about how we're able to talk about that. And we know that this is, a top of the moment kind of issue for almost everybody out there about having these types of conversations. So Kate, I'm going to turn it back to you to maybe frame up, difficult conversations in business, and we'll keep building on our framework.
And I think, Kristin, let's get out on the table from folks here about what's bringing them to this conversation. What are you all wrestling with? We just love to hear so that we can be responsive to what it is that you are thinking.
Sounds good, Kate. So if you could share with us in the chat, what brought you here today? What are some of the difficult conversations you're thinking about having, might be struggling with? We want to learn more from you. So please, I'll call out some of the issues coming up in the chat.
Seeing lots of hellos from different part of the world. Oh, here we go. Difficult conversations at work. Okay, keep these coming.
Giving difficult feedback. Lack of accountability. Silo thinking. How to get to a solution that works without burning a bridge. Employee performance. How do you give feedback to colleagues? What do you do for clients who are struggling around polarized topics? Race relations, inequity, social injustice, solutions, not silos. Struggling to call things out and redirect conversations. We have a lot coming through the chat. DEI can be a difficult conversation. Team leaders being at odds, power struggles, not being able to see eye to eye, lack of trust. How do you align when you have different points of view on a topic?
Yep.
Transformation, when your organization's going through a change. Cultural difference. How do you have a difficult conversation without getting personal in the workplace?
Good one.
How do you manage up and have difficult conversations with your leader?
Yeah, these are great.
Ask for headcount and manage burnout. There's a lot of energy in the chat and many topics coming up. Difficulties around implementation and transformation. Let's see. How do you communicate trust?
Yeah, these are great. Well, we really appreciate all of this feedback and the variety of topics. I think we will touch on a fair number of these throughout the time that we have today, if not in our initial framing, throughout our Q&A. And then I think we're committed to also following up as need be with some of the questions that we're not able to get to. So this is great. Keep it coming because it's so helpful for us to see kind of where the pain points are right now as you're navigating kind of this post-pandemic or still pandemic world. It's a really interesting time. So Kate, how are we feeling? Ready to jump in?
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge that the title of this talk is about difficult conversations. So what is a difficult conversation anyway? Well, it's definitely one where we might feel a lot of emotions about having it, or even the anticipation of having it. Oftentimes these are scary conversations for us. Maybe we don't have the answers, and maybe we don't even know how to approach having the conversation. We're not sure what the solutions are. There's a lot of uncertainty. We're worried about trust and what might happen to trust. And many of you brought up trust in this. So we'd like to give you a simple framework that's what we built the listening challenge around that we think can help you begin to enter into these conversations. It won't take away the emotions, But when you have a framework to think about a simple one, it can help give you something to hang on to as you're heading into the great unknown of that difficult conversation. It makes it a little bit less unknown and a little bit less emotional. So Kara, will you tell us about the first step of that, which is so important to get right, around the setting the container? And we're going to kind of tag team and walk you through the 4.5 steps, if you will.
Yeah. So I think there's a critical point that I'd like a chance to make here, which is when we have difficult conversations that we know that we need to engage in, there's a pattern that I've seen over and over again in this work. And in the face of difficult conversations, it's almost like to work up our individual courage, to have the guts to have those hard conversations. We go through a process of, this is why I'm right, and this is why that other person is wrong. And in doing so, we're kind of like, well, they're other, and and we're very different. If we're not seeing eye to eye about something, we must be very different from each other. And this person is other from me. And this person is bad or wrong. And it gives me a righteous courage. I don't know, when I say that, I don't know who in this space who's listening feels that come up for them. It's like, that's right. I feel righteous in having this conversation. It's like a critical thing, that needs to take place. And I just want to say, like, let's let that piece go, right? It can be really dangerous, really threatening, to the trust that we're trying to build. And this very first step that, we kind of engage in this framework is creating the container to have a safe and trusting conversation. When we don't have that practice with each other, or we've had some bad experiences with each other and having a conversation in the past, sometimes we just really need to be thoughtful and to frame. Hey, I know this could be a hard conversation for us to have, and I just thought it might be helpful for us to have a few supportive guidelines that each of us can follow, that help us signal to each other that we're gonna have this tough conversation, and we're gonna play by some supportive rules with each other. And here's a few examples that we have found in our work can really help and support. And if you have other suggestions, we really welcome you putting them into the chat if you have ones that have worked for you. But can we agree to listen first to understand and not to formulate a response? When we do that, it gives us an opportunity to reflect, like, what I hear you saying is, did I get that right? I think we can have this conversation by setting aside the need to be right and just enter this conversation in curiosity. What can we learn from each other? What can we learn about each other in this conversation? So it's not about needing to be right in this moment. A guiding principle can be that we treat each other with respect. We may not interrupt each other. We wait and we listen to what the other person has to say. We provide opportunity for equal airtime in a conversation. I'm sure many of you have been in conversations where it's just, one person, talks a lot, or maybe you're the person who talks a lot to fill what might feel like awkward silence at times, but just really giving space and encouraging equal airtime. I think our approach and model says that we'll speak from our own experiences and perspectives and our own stories and our own interpretation of moments, and really stay within that space. And that helps us build understanding and empathy. And that we'll listen and participate with resilience, that this is, this conversation is hard. We are working through something difficult, and we're committed to moving forward. And we just keep coming back at that. A final one that I think we found to be pretty powerful is to say, we're approaching this conversation with our best intentions. And we also understand that what we say and what we do has impact. And we also take accountability for that when it does have impact. So it's just kind of, working through a few shared principles that help, at the beginning. And I don't know how many of you, like, you just think to yourself right now, like at the beginning of a conversation, or even in the middle of a conversation, like you realize, gosh, this is getting heated, or this is getting tough. And you just literally stop the conversation and say, hey, it seems like we're wandering into territory that feels pretty charged, pretty polarized, pretty attacking. Why don't we just pause here and set up a few guiding principles or supportive guidelines that can help us navigate the rest of this conversation? Don't be shy about doing that. Just interrupt, create the space, and lay that groundwork, and it will help you have the rest of your conversation. So then that's just to set the container. Kate's going to give us our next piece of our model that that we suggest.
And what Kara just talked about setting those agreements or expectations about you could call them ground rules for the conversation, are really important, because then when you go through these 4 steps that we're about to talk about, and someone strays from those, you have then a set of agreements that you can come back to, and you're not just making them up on the spot. So, okay, so setting the container, the expectations is sort of like step 0. Then we have four steps of the listening challenge. The first one of which is to connect. And I find in a business context, a lot of times people want to move very quickly to this create step, but they may not take the time to slow down. A lot of what we do in our work is talk about slowing down to move at the speed of trust. Because if you try to move too quickly to create without connecting first and moving through some of the other steps, and you haven't built that trust and that personal connection, then your solutions will fall apart. So it might look good at the beginning, but then it doesn't last. So connecting is about, and in the listening challenge, is about making space for people to talk about their personal connections to the issue that you're talking about by telling a personal story, if people are willing to do that. And we all have to decide how much we want to reveal in the moment. It's important to only reveal as much as you want to reveal and feel safe revealing, but creating a space for people to talk about that personal connection. Why do I care so much about this issue anyway? And then being able to connect with each other personally before you move on to try to create solutions. So in the listening challenge, which you can read about, I'll put a link into chat about what Kara and I wrote about doing this with our own dads. And we started by asking each other in a dialogue, how am I connected with the issues of, politics right now in our country? And I got to share some stories with my dad about growing up, walking on our front lawn with bare feet and noticing there were signs saying this lawn is covered with pesticides and you shouldn't be walking on it in your bare feet. And those are some of the early origins of the work that I do today around corporate sustainability. And I got to hear from him some stories about growing up and being bullied in school and how that shaped his views about national safety and security. So if you as a leader take the time to slow down and create space for people to talk about how they're connected to the issues, that then lets them connect with each other, just as I found I did with my dad. He and I vote very differently. But then I could suddenly see, oh, this is why he cares about this issue in this way. And he was able to see that. It's a very satisfying kind of thing. Okay, so Kara, over to you, and Kara will talk about this inspire step.
Yeah, so I think the inspire step is really critical, because once we built a little bit of trust and vulnerability really with the other person by really drawing from personal experiences and this kind of sharing stories, there is an opportunity to kind of find common ground and to create a shared vision, and that's where that inspiring vision gets you through hard times together. And in the case of listening challenge, and if we continue with kind of more personal conversations around conversations with our fathers, in my particular case, the question that I asked my father was, what his vision was, what makes the United States, a wonderful country, and what his vision was for the United States. What would success look like, really, for the country? And then I answered that question too. And in any conversation that any of you are having out there, a framing for that question could be, if we were able to resolve or address this challenge, what would success look like? What would a positive outcome be? And when each person takes time to really share and answer those questions, almost 100% of the time, there are points of commonality, something that each one of you is excited about, and pointing those places out. Look, we both want this. Look at something that we share, together. And for my father and I, it was like we had shared values around family. We had shared values around the world that we wanted to create for children and grandchildren. And we were able to build from that, to say, look how much we have in common. Let's take that shared vision that we have and let's move forward from that place as we work through, the next steps, as we work through, what some solutions or path forward might be. And it's really coming to this place of how can we lead together, or how can we work together towards this shared vision. So that shared vision piece coming off the vulnerability of sharing stories is a powerful stage to set.
Great. So I will thank you for taking us through that. I will talk just briefly about this reflect step, and we want to also be sure to have time for your questions and such. Reflection is really important because, as Kara was saying initially, we often get in, when we head into a difficult conversations, we're very clear about our own point of view and why we're right. And we often come and we bring facts and data and lots of arguments and logic to defend our own point of view. Reflection is about creating a little bit of space between me and my beliefs, so that instead of my beliefs running me and getting me all amped up, I can have my beliefs instead of my beliefs having me, and I can control my belief system and reflect on it. So in the listening challenge, and there's a simple way to do this, which is equally good when you're having a conversation with your dad, as we did, or in business, is to simply ask people, what are the benefits or upsides of the other side's point of view? And what are some of the downsides or risks of, your own position or point of view? And asking people that explicitly and creating a space where people can reflect on that together. And you're not asking them to say, what's wrong with my point of view? But, just to create a little bit of space and ask people to reflect on those benefits on the other side and downsides of, your side. It doesn't have to be yourself, but say your side can create a little bit of objectivity. And then you're creating what organizational psychologist Adam Grant calls opportunities for change talk, rather than just sustain talk. You open the opportunity for change talk. Oh, gee, I didn't realize that there were actually some points that the other side is making that are maybe have a little bit of validity. Doesn't have to be a lot, but just a little bit. And gee, maybe there's just a little something that I don't agree with about my own side's position or point of view. Just a little bit of space loosens things up and creates an opportunity for this create step that Kara's going to talk about.
Yeah. So if we think about kind of the journey we've been on so far, we've created a container where we can have a hard conversation. We have, some supportive guidelines or ground rules that are help holding the space for us to do this. We've each been vulnerable by sharing a little bit of how we came to develop our personal views as it relates to the topic at hand. We've gone through a process where we've found some commonalities, frankly, and a shared vision, an inspiring shared vision about where we might want to get to on this particular topic. And then we've looked at the issue from multiple angles, different angles, especially in polarized conversations, to say, I see the validity of that. I see the possibility of that. I hadn't thought about it that way. And that really sets the groundwork for, being able to create something together, to say, hey, what is one next step that we could take together that could, move us closer to a solution to this issue? And because we trust each other a little bit more, we understand each other a little bit more, we're working towards a shared direction more than when we started this conversation. We are able to then say there's an action, there's a commitment that we can make to each other for where we can go next on this topic. And I think taking the time to really identify what that commitment or next step is, and having a check-in process to say, okay, we did that. How did we go? How did it go? Continues to build trust. It's like this positive reinforcing loop to say, hey, we're approaching this with curiosity, not with the need to be right. I'm approaching this from a place of wanting to solve this painful thing, And we're each committing to something and building trust through that process. And I think we all know that the change only moves at the speed of trust for this work. And so from there, it's dialogue to say, what's that one next thing that we can do, that we can try together to move forward. And there's an outcome that you can see from that, something that you can build on, and that might be a shared threat or issue that you see out in the world, or it might be something just right internally that immediately makes things better through a process in your own work environment. So whether it's big or small, this model works for opening up space for a difficult conversation. So I know we would love to get to some questions and definitely make this kind of more dynamic. Kate, let me just check in with you. Is there any kind of last or final point you'd like to make or make sure comes across to our audience today?
I think we should dive into questions that you all might have, and Kristin, help us
Sure.
answer questions here.
I see a couple of themes coming up in the chat, and one of them is around dealing with a difficult person. So a few comments have come up around how do you deal with it when someone doesn't respect you, or they're putting up a wall, or there's someone who has an entrenched belief system, and it appears that they're not rational. So the question is, what do you do when someone violates the conversation agreements, is disrespectful, commits a microaggression?
Well, I can start with that, and I would just reiterate that is why it is so important to, before you enter into a difficult conversation, to establish some of those ground rules or agreements and talk about, for instance, respect. What does it look like to respect somebody, and what does a microaggression look like, so that we're all collectively on the same page and can recognize it when that occurs, or if it occurs. And there's a lot of work now. I'm a white American. I have unconscious bias, and that I need to be able to own. And I also, given my own background, know that there's a lot that I don't know and continue to need to learn. And so just acknowledging that we are all learning. We come with our backgrounds and our biases, and we are going to stumble. And part of the important thing is creating an environment where it is not only okay to stumble, but it is going to happen. And we are going to do things out of unconscious motivations that we will then discover and then have to learn about. So, and I'll put a tool in that I learned. Also, it's important to teach people what to do when something does happen. And it's a tool that I learned from a colleague called Akasha at Cultivating Leadership, and it's called roar. So when something happens that is disrespectful, it's important to recognize what's happened, to own it, to own that, yes, I just did that. I just said this something that had an impact and it was hurtful. To be accountable for it. I alone am accountable and responsible for what comes out of my mouth. It might be unconscious, but I'm still responsible for it. I'm accountable and need to take that responsibility, and then make a repair to the extent that, that I can try to make a repair. Obviously, it's up to the other person to see, how much do they want to engage with me after I've just microaggressed on them, but to offer that as a possibility. So roar, recognize, own, be accountable, take responsibility, and make a repair, so that when people are disrespectful or make microaggressions, which will happen as we're having difficult conversations, let's not be let's not be naive here. Then we know how to deal with that when it happens.
Yeah, I wanted to just build on this quickly as well. And I feel like when you feel disrespected, or you're working with a person who feels difficult to you and feels like a real challenge to navigate, I think there's a couple of things that I would bring up here. One, know thyself. Who do you want to be in these moments? because I think sometimes these conversations are really triggering for us, and we kind of lose track of, the values and the ways that we really want to show up to hard conversations. And sometimes I go into difficult conversations or difficult facilitations, really holding the thread of who do I want to be in this moment? And really living up to those values so that I don't waver too far from them. Sometimes reframing the issue, somebody coming at you hard with something, stepping back from it, right? And saying, okay, I think what I hear you saying in that comment is that you really care about X. Like you're not ready to come back to the office and you'd prefer to work from home. And can you tell me more about that? So you take aggression and you meet it with a reframing. Almost, it's not a deflection, but it's just a reframing of this aggression that's coming to you, and you put it back out in a neutral way that allows you to have a conversation about the issue. And you continue to invite and invite and invite the ability to have that conversation. Let's bring it back to the issue. Let's bring it back to the issue, and just don't take the bait of the personal. And then when something really does sting, when something really does hurt and really hits home and you can feel the trigger go for you, name the impact. So that might feel like a moment to withdraw. It might feel like wow, that really hurt. Sometimes you may say, hey, I need to hold off on this conversation. Let's re-enter it tomorrow. I'm committed. I still want to have this. I just can't have it right now. But another thing that you can do in the moment is say, hey, I just want to reflect back a little bit to you how I experienced that comment, that microaggression, that, whatever it might be. This is how I interpreted that. And I wanted you to know that hurt me, or it felt like you didn't respect me. Can you tell me more? Can you tell me more about why you said that or why you did that?
Thank you, Kate and Kara. We have a question from the audience from Nandith C. Ravindran. I hope I said your name correctly, Nandith. How do you interrupt a leader or a peer who doesn't allow others to talk in a typical conversation?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I know there's some other questions in here too about, sometimes people aren't interested in win-win conversations. They want to be right. They want to take up all the space. They want to control and dominate. And, we're, of course, advocating listening, empathy, personal vulnerability, but you also have to be prepared to deal with people who are maybe not interested in those things, at least not right off the bat. So how do you deal with that is a really important thing to be prepared to handle. So I would say, first of all, I'm going to drop actually, Courtney, could you drop the interrupting bias resource into chat? There's a distinction in the kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion work that I'm familiar with around calling out versus calling in. And if you're dealing with someone who's interrupting, who is, not playing by the values of the organization, it's important to be able to call that out. And you can do that in a very respectful way and say something like, I know that in this organization, for instance, one of our values is respect, for instance, in a lot of organizations it is. And, I'm seeing that, what's happening here, and you may want to call this out publicly, but it also may make sense if it's risky for you to do so, to have that conversation privately at first. But relate what you're seeing back to some sort of larger values that your organization stands for, or the ground rules of conversation that you've already agreed to. If you try to just do this by yourself, it's going to be difficult. You're going to feel like you're swimming upstream. But again, finding something that has already been established and agreed to, at least in your organization, as some sort of value or principle that says this is how we've agreed to operate with one another. And I don't think we're operating like that right now. That's calling out. On the other side, you can also call in, which is, for instance, saying something like, I'm really curious what's going on here. And it seems like, a couple of people are taking up a lot of space. And I'm just wondering if anyone else is noticing that. Now, that can be risky to do in certain contexts. But, you would need to decide, maybe that's a conversation to have with a smaller group. For instance, the leader of a team. Maybe that leader needs to pay more attention to someone who's continually interrupting, and then relate it back to, like, we've agreed in this company or this team to try to be inclusive, and I'm noticing this. And I'm curious about what's happening for you as a leader or for other people. And so to get people to talk about the impact.
Yeah. One of the things that I'll just quickly say is that you probably hear, as Kate and I kind of reflect or kind of talk through what some scripting might be, we almost always come back to an open-ended question, an opportunity to learn more. And even, I hear in that question kind of a long game. It's something that's repeating itself over and over again in a meeting, or a pattern of behavior of a particular individual or leader. And I think when that happens, as a conversation that really helps co-create a solution. So conversation with that leader too, that could be on the side and say, hey, I'm noticing that this is happening in our meetings. I'm noticing that people seem really quiet, like they're not participating. What are some approaches we might, try, experiment with? Like, let's see if it makes a difference in this next meeting that we have tomorrow, to try something different. I read about, setting up some supportive guidelines. What do you think about trying that? So something that allows that leader to come along, see what the challenge is, and then also offers a potential solution that isn't set in stone, can be a way of just trying your way forward to something that works and kind of getting out of entrenched behaviors. And I think that feels pretty safe to somebody to notice, hey, I notice that people are pretty quiet in meetings too. I wonder why that is. Why don't we create more room for them to share? Maybe we go around and let each person have an opportunity to speak. Something like that, I think, can be very powerful as well.
Thank you, Kate and Kara. Another theme that's coming up is around language and culture and how they can make a conversation harder. A question from the audience is, what do you suggest for someone who identifies as an underrepresented minority to confront difficult conversations, especially when people of color are often told they're disruptive when they're attempting to call people in? So on calling people in, Kate, what can the person in the room do when they're not the leader of a conversation, and they're feeling uncomfortable confronting something very difficult? You have some suggestions?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And so on the one hand, I would defer to people of color who for ideas. And as a white American, one of the first things I would do is to create some listening spaces, because my own biases will prevent me from seeing the potential of what is needed. And I think that's a lesson for, certainly for white leaders, is that, people in power and the dominant sort of cultural group, at least, I'm speaking as an American, are not going to have those answers. But what I can do is know that there's a problem, and then create the listening space to hear from the people who are going to be able to tell me what's needed. So I watched a couple of white CEO and his leadership team do this in Chicago at Rush University Medical Center, which is an organization I studied. And they created employee listening groups, and really actually created a deliberate space where they wanted to really hear the experience of people of color and underrepresented groups about what they needed to do to change the power structures and the incentives and what was happening in the organization. And to the folks who are underrepresented and don't have that kind of are not being listened to, I would advise, even if the folks who have the power in the organization are not listening, organize anyway, and make them listen, because that there's a strength in numbers and coming together and sharing your ideas and creating that kind of groundswell of a voice that cannot be ignored is unfortunately, if the folks who are in power are not listening, that is a lesson that we know from the civil rights movement in this country. It's that is needed. It's almost like a social movement within an organization. I hate to even say that that's what has to happen sometimes, but that's what I would advise and what I have seen work.
Two other pieces I would build onto that, Kate. Thank you. And I saw something pop up in the chat about kind of the onus being on a marginalized individual to kind of need to lead through there. And I think we've heard a lot around the role of allies and thinking about whether there are, through those same types of trusted conversations, somebody that you trust can reach out to and say, hey, I wonder if I might just be able to share some of my experiences with you, something like what we were outlining in the listening challenge, so that I can share how I'm experiencing some of the things that are happening in our meetings. And this may not be the leader yet, this may not be the person who's, microaggressing, or if there's a larger culture around that, but just starting to build some trusted individuals who can be allies and perhaps can activate to say, hey, we as a company, we as a department, we as a team really need to take this on, and we want to be the ones to help hold space. We've come to understand what this looks like for some of our colleagues. And then the second piece that I was just going to quickly offer is modeling the behavior a little bit yourself, which again is like a hard place to be when you're the one really experiencing this moment. But sometimes, calling attention to, hey, I'm noticing that we may have some cultural differences about how we're responding to this. Here's how I'm experiencing that, and maybe starting with things that feel maybe a little less charged, but just like practicing the behavior of calling out differences in uncharged moments, so that when it is a charged moment, it's like, oh yeah, we've been working that into our language more. We've been working that into our dialogue more. We are paying more attention to that. And now that a charged issue has come up in this moment, we're not starting from scratch in that moment. So just a couple of additional thoughts.
I'm noticing just a couple of comments in chat, which is so important about, or is what we're saying, then putting the burden back on underrepresented minorities, and Kara, you were just speaking to that. And, that is such an important point. And I would just say to that should never be the case. And I think what we teach in nimble distributed leadership is, if you're trying to build some sort of campaign for change, no, the burden should not be on underrepresented minorities. Absolutely not. And so, who is listening that you could connect with, so that it's not such a burden for you. If the folks who have the power in the organization are not listening, not interested, who are the allies? Who are the people who are going to partner with you, and starting with them, so that they can help share that burden, and going to the people who really do get it and do understand and can take some of that burden on for you. So who are the allies? White allies and the diversity, equity, inclusion work that we're trying to do in this country. So allyship is hugely important, because then that burden becomes a shared burden, and we are all suffering because of these dynamics. So in different ways, there's no way that we can be successful in business, in life, if these kinds of oppressive dynamics are going on, and folks who are allies will understand that and help share some of that burden.
And Kristin, I know we probably have time for maybe one or two more questions, but I did see a comment that started with all due respect. I think if a Black woman were to respond to this question, they would respond differently. And I just want to acknowledge that, and I want to appreciate that honesty and space holding that just came through on the chat. And one thing I would just really encourage is, there's a collective wisdom in this group that has come together today. And if you have a different story, if you have a different experience, if you have an idea, especially in this space of the topic that we were just discussing, I would love for you to share it here in the chat. And if we are able to follow up with a blog post for questions we weren't able to get to, I would love to call out some of the great ideas that you all have put forth in the chat. So definitely recognizing limitations and the wisdom of the folks that are participating here as well. Kristin, I'll turn it back to you. I know I'm sure you have another question you'd like to get in.
Sorry. I think there's just one more question. Kate, you've talked about calling in, you've talked about calling out, and lots of different strategies and tactics. But, how do we call on the contributions from participants or our colleagues who, out of bias, like they usually keep quiet? How can we help them?
How can we help the colleagues who just restate it?
How can we help our colleagues in a meeting who don't speak up because out of bias that they keep quiet? How can we recognize their contributions and bring them into the dialogue?
Well, just to say briefly, and Kara, I can tell you have a response, but I would, one thing that's an easy place to start is by asking them, and in the spirit of vulnerability, say, I know that you have a lot to bring to the table, and whatever that is, and be authentic in that interaction. And I would love to get that into the room. What's the best way for me to help that happen? Because I know this team would really value and benefit from your perspective, your experience, your background. Maybe give them a couple of options to choose from, but really let them drive and give them an opportunity to help you as a leader understand how to include their voice.
Thank you.
And building on that, in an environment, so we're all in meetings day in, day out. We might be in larger collaborative settings. We might be in our small team meetings that we're in. And it's pretty amazing. I think a lot of times people feel like, oh, the person who's facilitating or the leader in this space really drives the dynamic of that meeting. And there's plenty of truth to that. But I'm also amazed about what you as a participant can offer into this space, the way you can redirect or reframe as a participant when you get an opportunity to speak. So if you're somebody who does speak more, if you're somebody who will get out there, get yourself out there and then pass the baton, say, oh, I've been thinking about this and I would really love to hear what, so-and-so and so-and-so have to think about this. I can see, that you guys are really thinking deeply about this. I'd love to, just create the moment in the meeting and then hand it over. You don't have to take up the airspace. You can hand it over to somebody else within there. And if it's somebody that, you're just not hearing them to speak up, even in that circumstance, I think Kate's perspectives there about having a separate conversation to create that moment to say, hey, I noticed you're not participating particularly much. What's going on for you? What, is there something that's making you feel uncomfortable? Is there a concern that you have? How can I help and support you? How can I be your ally? And you can do that as a boss, a manager, or just a colleague, a peer. So just know that it doesn't have to be about the power structure, that there's lots of ways you can distribute that.
Thank you. So I think we're going to wrap up this conversation right here. I want to thank Kate and Kara for all of their very thoughtful answers and ideas that they've shared with you. And I want to thank everyone for your participation, your comments, and your questions today. This has been a very dynamic dialogue, and I hope you're taking something away that will help you. Kara and Kate are going to develop a blog post to answer some of the questions we couldn't get to today. But I also want to note that we're offering a course on distributed leadership, cultivating the nimble organization in person at MIT on November 3rd and 4th, if you want to dive into this topic more and how you can be more nimble and inclusive in how you're leading throughout your organization. So thank you, everyone, for being a part of this dynamic conversation today. Thank you for your contributions and your honesty.
Thanks so much, everybody.